Can I have a pool party when water is scarce? Do I always have to keep a promise? Can I sacrifice one person to save many? Act and rule utilitarians give very different answers to these questions. In this video, we will look at the most important differences between act and rule utilitarianism using 3 concrete examples. In the first half of the 20th century, utilitarianism was subject to sharp criticism. Above all, it was criticized for not corresponding to generally accepted moral convictions. For example, it could not adequately explain why one is morally obliged to keep promises, repay debts, tell the truth, or acquit the innocent. In classical utilitarianism, these obligations do not necessarily apply, but only in cases where such action results in a greater general good. Since the 1950s, attempts have been made to renew and improve utilitarianism on the basis of this criticism. The so-called rule utilitarianism emerged. This new version of utilitarianism is seen by some interpreters as a further development, by others merely as a more pointed formulation of the position already held by Bentham and Mill. The term rule utilitarianism was first used by James O. Urmson in his essay, The Interpretation of the Moral Philosophy of J.S. Mill. In it, Urmson interprets Mill's utilitarianism as a form of rule utilitarianism. However, this interpretation is controversial. More on this later. The American philosopher Richard B. Brandt finally established the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. John J.C. Smart had previously spoken of extreme and restricted utilitarianism. But what is the difference between these two positions? Act utilitarianism is understood to be classical utilitarianism. Smart calls it extreme utilitarianism. Here, the specific individual action is considered. One looks at whether the planned individual action will have more positive or more negative consequences for the well-being of all those affected. If the positive consequences predominate, the action is morally right. If the negative consequences predominate, it is morally wrong. Even in act utilitarianism, experience has shown that there are certain rules of thumb or common sense theorems that can make a decision easier. However, these can be overridden in individual cases. The rule, do not lie, for example, can be remembered spontaneously in decision-making situations in order to get an initial orientation. However, the decisive factor for the act utilitarian is whether the specific individual action increases the happiness of the greatest number or not. And then, one can certainly deviate from the rule of thumb and lying may be permitted. An act utilitarian asks himself the question, what will the consequences be if I act in this way in this specific situation? Representatives of act utilitarianism include Jeremy Bentham, Henry Sidgwick, and John J.C. Smart. However, classical utilitarianism faces a major difficulty. In every situation, the agent must reconsider who exactly is affected by the consequences, and then carry out the hedonistic calculation for all those affected. Mill already saw that there is often not enough time to do this, and advised people to stick to general rules and ask whether these rules, if generally followed, are useful or harmful overall. For this reason, Mill is also referred to by some interpreters as the father of rule utilitarianism. However, Mill is not a typical representative of rule utilitarianism. Moreover, act utilitarianism contradicts generally accepted moral convictions, such as keeping promises or acquitting the innocent. It contradicts our everyday morality or moral intuition to make the moral judgment of actions, such as murder, theft, or lying, dependent on a utilitarian calculation of consequences in individual cases. Certain actions immediately appear immoral to us. In addition, it undoubtedly plays a major role for the general benefit whether certain rules or norms can claim social acceptance and validity or not. Such rules are destabilized if they are allowed to be overridden in individual cases. However, one of the great strengths of act utilitarianism is precisely this possible deviation from rigid rules. It is always about the greatest possible well-being of all those affected. This means that the act utilitarian is flexible and can make decisions depending on the individual case. Rule utilitarianism now proposes to apply the utility test not to individual actions, but to types, classes, or rules of actions. The principle of utility is therefore not applied to the specific individual action, but to the rule behind the action. It is no longer a question of which action, but which rule brings the greatest benefit to the general public. Moral decisions must always be in line with rules, regardless of the positive or negative consequences in individual cases. This gives rules a completely different binding force than in classical utilitarianism. While they may be violated in act utilitarianism, in rule utilitarianism they must be followed, even if the consequences of action are catastrophic in a specific individual case. For example, since the prohibition of killing is a rule whose general application is undoubtedly useful, even tyrannicide cannot be justified. This means that rule utilitarianism is no longer a consequentialist or teleological ethics in the strict sense. The consequences of the specific individual action are not taken into account. The question is no longer whether a single individual failure to keep a promise or condemnation of an innocent person has good consequences, but whether the rule of not keeping promises or condemning innocent people leads to good or bad consequences. If the consequences of the rule under which the action falls are bad, the action itself is considered morally wrong, even if the consequences of the individual action should be good. The rule is assessed according to the fictitious consequences that would arise if everyone followed this rule. In rule utilitarianism, the question is asked, what would the consequences be if everyone acted in this way in such cases? Strictly speaking, rule utilitarianism is therefore a deontological ethics. Although it has a teleological or consequentialist basis, the rules are judged on the basis of their consequences. Its actual approach is deontological. It examines whether an individual action complies with a particular rule. The main representative of rule utilitarianism is Richard B. Brandt. Urmson also counts John Stuart Mill as a rule utilitarian. However, this is controversial. Among other things, Mill pointed out that there must be exceptions to rules, as a system based on countless binding rules is inflexible. A strict rule utilitarian should not allow such exceptions. Let's summarize briefly. In both act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, the moral correctness of an action is judged according to whether it promotes the general welfare. However, different methods are used for the assessment. The evaluation process is one stage in act utilitarianism and two stage in rule utilitarianism. According to act utilitarianism, the morally right action is the one whose consequences lead to maximum general well-being. According to rule utilitarianism, it is the action that corresponds to rules of action that promote maximum welfare. In other words, rules of action that are optimal for the well-being of all are first established in line with the utilitarian calculation. And then it is checked whether the individual action complies with these rules of action. The universalist principle is also interpreted differently. Act utilitarianism considers the actual expected consequences for all those involved in the action. Rule utilitarianism considers the hypothetical consequences under the assumption that everyone follows a certain rule that permits such action. One of the main advantages of rule utilitarianism is that it saves time. Establishing general rules saves the time needed to carry out the tedious hedonistic calculation in each individual case. We can think collectively and without pressure to act about what is morally required and agree on generally applicable rules. Moreover, these rules are in line with general moral guidelines and do not contradict people's moral intuition, as is often the case with moral decisions in act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism also offers a plausible answer to the free rider problem. A single free rider would not have a major impact on the general cost-benefit balance. However, if everyone acted in this way, the consequences for the general public would be extremely negative. Acting according to established rules that everyone can subsequently rely on without exception also promotes social trust. They help us to predict how people who follow them will act. However, these advantages of rule utilitarianism are also disadvantages. Fixed rules mean you lose flexibility and can no longer weigh up and decide individually in individual cases. Exceptions to the rules are not permitted, even if this would maximize the well-being of all. One could even go so far as to say that rule utilitarianism is no longer a consequentialist, but a deontological ethics. Such ethics is accused of moral rigorism and detachment from reality. The German philosopher Dieter Bernbacher describes rule utilitarianism as an ethical hybrid between consequential ethics and deontological ethics. The only difference between the two is the utilitarian justification of the rules, the observance of which focuses on the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and therefore on consequences and inclinations. Let us now illustrate the difference between the two positions of act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism using 3 concrete examples. How would an act utilitarian and a rule utilitarian decide and act in these cases? Let's start with the famous pool dilemma. Frank lives in the city of X and has a pool in the garden. In a hot summer, the residents of X are asked to limit their water consumption to the bare minimum due to the existing water shortage. While the other owners of garden pools comply with this request and refrain from bathing in the interest of a secure drinking water supply, Frank uses his pool for a pool party. He rightly assumes that the amount of water for one garden pool is not significant in the city's overall water balance, but that he will be able to please his expected party guests with a pool party. Frank therefore chooses the alternative action with the best consequences. Isn't he still acting morally wrong? According to act utilitarianism, the decision is morally correct, as the positive consequences outweigh the negative ones for all concerned. The amount of water used for one garden pool is insignificant in the overall water balance of the city, and the party guests are very happy to cool off on a hot summer's day. Frank and his party guests benefit here as free riders from self-restriction by the other city residents. According to rule utilitarianism, however, using the pool is morally wrong, because if everyone acted in this way, there would not be enough water for everyone in the city, and there would be more pain than pleasure for the general public. A rule that allows all residents of a city to use their pools when water is scarce would not maximize the general well-being. Such a rule would have more negative than positive consequences. This dilemma is a form of the free rider problem. This occurs when a public resource is overused or destroyed through selfish action, which ultimately reduces the group benefit. We see this problem, for example, in the overfishing of the oceans, the abuse of social benefits, or tax evasion. Rule utilitarianism offers a plausible solution to this problem, whereas act utilitarianism does not. Second case. Mr. Smith has promised 12-year-old Ben that he will give him 20 euros if he mows his lawn. From the open window, Mr. Smith hears Ben arranging to meet his older friends for the evening. The 20 euros are to be spent on vodka and cigarettes. Shouldn't Mr. Smith donate the money to support a child in Somalia who could live on it for a month? An act utilitarian would donate the money to the Somali child. With 20 euros, more good can be done in poorer countries than with Ben, who will use the money to harm himself and others. Normally, keeping a promise is the best thing for general well-being. However, in this specific case, there are convincing reasons to deviate from this rule of thumb. Mr. Smith is allowed to break his promise, as this is the best way to promote the general welfare. A rule utilitarian, on the other hand, would have to keep the promise. After all, a rule according to which promises do not have to be kept would result in more pain than pleasure in a society as a whole. In such a society, no one would be able to rely on others, there would be no more trust, and therefore no possibility of social cooperation. But an act utilitarian could also argue in favor of keeping the promise, following Bentham. Bentham was of the opinion that in each individual case, there is also an act utilitarian justification for the fulfillment of given obligations, such as promises or contracts. If someone does not keep their promise, they cause great harm. He undermines the institutions of promise and contract that provide trust and predictability throughout society. In addition, Mr. Smith is damaging his reputation as a reliable partner and thus also his own interests. No one would mow his lawn or make any other arrangements with him. Last example. There are 5 patients in a clinic who are all urgently waiting for an organ transplant. There is also a patient in the hospital who is there for a checkup. He has all the organs needed. As it is impossible for the attending physician to procure the necessary organs, he is thinking about sacrificing the healthy patient in favor of the others. For a rule utilitarian, the answer would be quite clear. No one would establish a general rule that would allow doctors to kill patients for the sake of their organs. This would not be permitted, even if it were certain from a medical point of view that the patients in question were exclusively patients who would soon die. The consequences that could be derived from such a rule would be exclusively negative. No one could be sure of their life anymore. No one would dare to go to hospital. For an ACT utilitarian, the assessment of this case would be much more complex. He would have to weigh up his actions carefully. At first glance, it seems legitimate to sacrifice one patient in order to save 5 patients. But what if the healthy patient is an important, popular, and influential politician or company owner who can do a lot of good for society? And the 5 patients waiting for donor organs are criminals. Then the ethical cost-benefit calculation would be completely different, and the community would be spared further pain and costs by the death of the 5 patients. This example illustrates the well-known problem of utilitarianism. The consequences of an action cannot be predicted with certainty and are at best probable. It cannot be ruled out with certainty that the rescued politician will start a nuclear war a few years later, or that the company owner will donate all his money to a terrorist organization. And analogous to the lawnmower example, an ACT utilitarian could again argue for an unconditional prohibition of killing innocent people. For the killing of an individual patient for the purpose of organ removal would also have such catastrophic consequences for society as a whole from an ACT utilitarian perspective that it should be rejected, at least if anyone were to find out about it. What is your opinion? Does rule utilitarianism manage to solve the difficulties of ACT utilitarianism, or does it cause greater problems? Which of the 2 positions convinces you more? And how would you have decided in the 3 cases?